tell you that so this meeting is being recorded. It will be shared on our website later. So full disclosure, I want to just for purposes and respect out of everybody's time, I want to start on time so we will have more people joining us. My name is Tiffany Turner Allen. I'm the executive director of nonprofit Prince George's County. I want to also thank my colleague Maya Washington, who is here with us helping to facilitate this. But I'm excited about today's courageous conversation. So we have launched this conversation series about a year ago, and we've had some really interesting talks and discussions. And it's really been about racial equity, how it shows up, how it doesn't show up, and we've pulled in experts across many different, many different spaces along many different professional fields. And so I'm really excited about this one because I feel like it's very timely. And so today we're talking with Black scholars about the history of Prince George's County. And the reason that is just so significant for me, not only as a resident of Prince George's County, a longtime resident of Prince George's County, but also as the executive director of nonprofit Prince George's County. We are a membership based coalition where we serve all the nonprofits in Prince George's County. And I call Prince George's County a majority melanated community. I know that that's not what people are used to hearing, but that's how we use it. I don't use the other terminology that people have typically used, but it's important to talk about where we are and how we have gotten to this place historically. We have talked about these key disparities that have existed throughout COVID, and as though it's surprising. We have heard people talk about Prince George's County on this from this standpoint of being the most affluent county for African Americans in the country. And I am excited to be able to have both Dr. Roger Davidson and Dr. Tony Gass with us, both scholars from Bowie State University. And I don't like to read people's bios. I don't think that you ever do a person justice in terms of reading their bio, a couple of words that are put on paper. I would like for you to both take a few moments to introduce yourself personally and professionally to the audience. So, can we start with you, Dr. Davidson? Tell us just a little bit about who you are and the work that you do, your professional space.
All right, my name is Roger Davidson. I am a lifelong resident of Washington, D.C. and Maryland, born and raised and spent most of my life in Washington, D.C. Moved out to Prince George's County in 2014, and 2004. I'm a proud Prince George's County, at this point. And so, and a proud Marylander. And that leads to my studies. I received a bachelor's degree in economics from Virginia Polytechnic Institute, MA and PhD degrees from Howard University in US history, with a focus on military and diplomatic history. But my studies in military history are specifically dealing with blacks and black soldiers and sailors and insurrection during the Civil War, of course, insurrection in the Chesapeake region. And that's to include Maryland and Virginia. I am now an associate professor at Bowie State University. I've been there 5 years. Previously, I was at Coppin State University.
Thank you. That is an
Good,
interesting background. Hopefully, we'll be able to get more into that. Dr. Gass.
good afternoon, Dr. Tony Gass. Say for 10 years, lifelong resident of Prince George's County, and I'll sometimes refer to it as PG. I know some people are trying to move away from that, but I grew up calling it PG, so it's going to remain PG. I will sprinkle Prince George's in there when it's appropriate. Born in Washington, D.C., Old Columbia Hospital for Women. It's no longer there, once on Pennsylvania Avenue. But raised in Prince George's County, places like Seat Pleasant, Capitol Heights, now Largo. Schooling entirely in Prince George's County, from North Forest Vera Elementary to Phyllis E. Williams Elementary to Kettering Middle School to Largo High School. Did my undergraduate at Bowie State University, received my Bachelor of Science in 1994, did my master's at Morgan State University in Baltimore, 2001. And then again, I spent 10 years out in the Midwest, 2005 to 2015, did my PhD at Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, and then worked a year at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. Came back here in 2015. I'm an adjunct professor at Bowie State University. I'm also very interested I've gotten into the last couple of years of taking students and others on excursions or tours of particular places, particularly focusing on African-American history. My specialization is more in 20th century African-American, specifically the Civil Rights Black Power movement. In fact, I did my dissertation on the Baltimore NAACP from 1935 to 1975, but I look more broadly at the struggle, particularly in border states in Maryland. So that engenders a lot of my focus, even though, of course, I have various interests in other areas as well. So it's a little bit about me.
Well, I want to thank both of you for committing to have this conversation today. And normally I wait to the end to say that this should be the beginning of a conversation, but I'm hoping that you all will both agree to come back, because there's such a wealth of knowledge that you both possess that we're not going to be able to capture all of it in this next hour. We'll just be able to scratch the surface. So I want to kind of jump in. So recently, I'm sure you are both aware of what happened a couple of weeks ago. I think it was a couple of weeks ago. Juneteenth has been made a federal holiday, right? So, I will tell you that here at Nonprofit Prince George's County, we advocated prior to that happening to push for the nonprofit sector to acknowledge Juneteenth as a day of remembrance for some and service for others. And so that's, didn't want to use the term holiday. And so we pushed that on a state level. But I know that there are some thoughts around that. And I wanted to find out from you all, what are your thoughts around this new interest? And if you think that the awareness level and education piece is there and in sync with Juneteenth, and then how does Juneteenth apply to Prince George's County? And are there any other dates that we need to think about or be mindful of when it comes to emancipation of formerly enslaved people in Prince George's County?
Roger, I'm going to defer to you first.
All right, thank you.
I got something to say.
Both of us sort of feel the same way about this, I believe. First of all, Juneteenth, and I want to go to that last piece. It's nice to have a day of remembrance, but Juneteenth does not specifically apply to Maryland. It's nice if we would broaden that to be more of an emancipation remembrance. Juneteenth is narrowly focused on Texas and the whole idea of people in the southern portions of Texas not hearing about the Emancipation Proclamation till Union troops made it down there in 1865. The issue, though, is that the people actually knew that the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued down there. They just couldn't act on it because they're surrounded, they're held captive, these enslaved individuals. But that being said, we're talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a wartime effort to get that Lincoln issued to get rebellious states back to the Union. Basically, all he said is if by January 1st of 1863, if you all have not ceased rebelling, have not come back to the Union, I'm going to free your slaves. And that's for those states in rebellion. Well, Maryland wasn't in rebellion. Kentucky wasn't in rebellion. Delaware wasn't in rebellion. There are other states that weren't in rebellion, those border states. Therefore, where he is trying to dictate to the Confederacy that he's going to free their slaves, which he really couldn't do unless he could get down there to free them, right? He's saying those who are not in rebellion, slavery is protected by the federal government. Basically, he's telling the South, come back and you can maintain slavery. Now, that doesn't make Lincoln a bad guy, because in my hometown of Washington, D.C., he experimented with compensated emancipation. He pushed Congress to end slavery in the District of Columbia in 1862, 8 months prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, and he paid $300. The federal government paid $300 for every enslaved person. So I grew up and lived as an adult celebrating Emancipation Day on April 16th. Right? In Maryland, it took the state legislature to end slavery. And that took effect on November 1st, 1864, almost 2 years after the emancipation, because, it would have flipped over to 1865, which would have been 2 years after January 1st, 1863. But it was November 1st, 1864, almost 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And what Juneteenth doesn't take into account are all those people of African descent, all those Africans in Maryland and throughout the United States who ran away. And like I say, my focus is the Civil War. As soon as war broke out and you have fighting going on, enslaved individuals, they took off. They ran where they could. If they could get into DC, which had a majority black free, the majority of the black population was free, they would run in there, assume a new identity. Out here in Maryland, slavery just started to slowly break down, even though it was protected. People were running to federal camps. Some would even cross over the Potomac River, which was dangerous, into Virginia, and then come rolling back, hoping the Navy would capture them and say, hey, we're from Virginia. So based upon Emancipation Proclamation, I'm free, or the Confiscation Act, or whatever you were using. But anyway, Juneteenth is so narrowly defined, it doesn't take in the breadth of emancipation. So I would like to have a remembrance on emancipation. It leaves out the agency of Blacks. It leaves out the full discussion. And hopefully Tony will pick up on anything that I've missed out. When it came to the 5 civilized nations, the Native Americans, some of them were did not obey the emancipation right until the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery in the United States. Slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist except for its punishment of a crime. Once this is ratified, slavery is over, not Juneteenth. I know I sound a little bitter, but I think in order for people in the US and for our children who are gaining this education to truly understand the emancipation saga, we need to go beyond just one thing and talk about all the different acts of emancipation, how Blacks were part of this, of emancipating and not just waiting for someone to free them. And that in itself is part of an American story, because people in the United States see themselves as enactors for freedom and liberation. Everyone's had a struggle. So this is our emancipation struggle. I'm sorry.
Please do not apologize. This is what we are. This is why we're having this conversation, because it is important to have our Black scholars that are educating us and being at the table to help move forward policy, to help move forward education. All of this is extremely critical. So I'm going to apologize because I'm interrupting Dr. Gass because he's ready to jump in like double dutch. So I'm going to.
No problem. And Dr. Davidson, in fact, we do think alike on this issue. We actually discussed some of this yesterday, matter of fact. One of my, again, I'm not disparaging Juneteenth in any way, shape, or form. I understand its importance. But as a historian, someone who wants, the truth as much as possible, it's problematic because in some of the points that Dr. Davidson had already mentioned, and I think one of the things I did this on a Facebook post. And I also will say that a historian named Carl Mack, who's in Washington State, he was on Roland Martin's show, and he made some of these same points. Is again, we're narrow. Some Black sites that I saw made it seem as if Juneteenth was the end of chattel slavery in the United States. They just said the end of slavery in the United States, or, for all intents and purposes, the end of slavery. And of course, we know, as Roger has already pointed out, we know that that is not the case. Places like Missouri, now Missouri, like Maryland, enacted emancipation as a state right before the Congress passed the 13th Amendment. So, and West Virginia, I believe, was also 1865 as well. But you still had Delaware and Kentucky, who again were not states in rebellion, to where the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply. So, and you had still technically held in enslavement hundreds of thousands of our ancestors back then, who weren't technically free until, again, the 13th Amendment in 1865, which was finally ratified by the states in December of 1865. And it should also be noted that Kentucky and Delaware never ratified the 13th Amendment at that time. Delaware didn't ratify until 1901. Kentucky didn't ratify until 1976. Mississippi, and Carl Mack, who's from Mississippi, noted that they didn't ratify until, I believe, 2013. So you had some states that took their good old time to be on the right side of history as far as this issue is dealt with. And as Roger already said, the 5 civilized tribes or nations, the 5 so-called civilized tribes and nations, the Cherokee, who many of us claim to be in their bloodline, the the Muskogee, also known as the Creek, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Seminoles. One of the reasons that Europeans designate them, and they also designate themselves as civilized, is they took on many European aspects. And one of them was chattel slavery. They enslaved us as well. And when they were forced to relocate from the southern United States to what became Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, they took us with them. Now, as Indian Territory, they were sovereign nations, which means in some instances, what the United States government dictated did not apply to them until they were forced under the Treaty of 1866, because they wanted to hold us in chattel slavery for as long as they possibly could. It wasn't until the United States pressed it in the Treaty of 1866 that they finally conceded that chattel slavery would no longer be the position of people of African descent in that area. So even after 1865, there was still a portion of our people that were under under enslavement. So it's just reiterating, we have to tell the whole story.
Right.
We have to tell the whole story. And we have to be truthful in that. We have to be as clear as possible. We have to be as concise as possible. We have to be, cross our T's, dot our I's with that. And I think even the bill itself, and I discussed this with Roger yesterday, it's called the Juneteenth Independence. I would have preferred emancipation or, some other language with that. So again, no disrespect to Mrs. Oral Lee, who went on a personal crusade to make Juneteenth a national emancipatory celebration, commemoration, however you want to term it. But again, as a historian, it didn't set right with me that the full story was not being told, particularly on such an important topic as this. But we sometimes know why Juneteenth was seceded too. There are many reasons for that. But as we said, the George Floyd Policing Act is still in limbo. The For the People Voting Act is still in limbo. The John Lewis Act is still in limbo. There's bipartisanship on this as a concession. See,
right.
We gave you all that. You should be happy with that. But, and let's not even get on reparations and things of that nature. That's a whole nother topic. Okay, that's a whole nother topic.
Look, so you jumping ahead. You have my questions, right? So I actually want to get to that topic if you will be able to touch on that briefly, based on some things that Dr. Davidson said. But before getting there, one of the things that I think is critical, and I'd like for you all to both shed some light on it, is Maryland, right? So when we think about the slaves that were, the states that were slave-holding states, right, that enslaved African people and people of African descent, we oftentimes haven't thought about Maryland. We think
Delaware.
Exactly. And we think about who seceded from the Union, and then we think that all the people who didn't secede, that it was because they were just completely in love and in belief of not for the enslavement of Black people. Can you, both of you, shed some light on Maryland's role, and in particular, we always hear about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and them being born in Maryland, but then also more specifically what the period of enslavement did to this area that we call Prince George's County today. Like, how did that shape and form? How was that showing up during that time?
Prince George's County had the largest number of enslaved laborers in the state. In fact, the county during the antebellum period, roughly 1830 to 1860, and even just a little bit before, would have resembled a deeper South state like South Carolina or Georgia. At one point, there was a slave majority in this state, just a slight slave majority, and it was fueled by tobacco. If you go down Bladensburg Road, there's port tobacco. Before the river became silted up, the Anacostia, boats would come up and they'd load up the tobacco and take it down. If you go up to the National Harbor and over to, Tangier Mall, there are historic signage talking about the enslaved individuals there. And I'm glad talking about some of the indigenous groups prior to that, but that was tobacco plantation up there. Bowie is named after Ogden Bowie and the Bowie family. They were huge slaveholders. I mean, they had a tobacco plantation. Now, that doesn't mean you need to change the names and stuff like that, because that's what Maryland, this portion of Maryland, was about. That's what brought about the wealth. And how it's a part of it is because when emancipation does come, some people are forced to remain on some of the farms and the plantations, but others are seeking to purchase land. You have men who served in the Army and the Navy, Black men, coming back with money in their pocket. The bounties, you get a cash bounty for having served, also money that you may have saved. They're coming home to buy land, or they're saving up to buy land. And so Black people are coming here, and I'm not going to stay on this, I'm just going to touch on it. But as time goes on, these descendants of Africans in Maryland are beginning to find ways to purchase land, which is from Quakers who lived here, who didn't mind selling land, other people who were subdividing their land and selling it. North Brentwood, it was subdivided by a captain named Bartlett, who was in charge of US colored troops during the Civil War. He bought land, divided it up. Brentwood went to white veterans. North Brentwood went to Black veterans. Of course, North Brentwood was bad land that flooded all the time. But these veterans had the money and the desire to form their own communities. So that is part of that legacy of slavery, a very positive legacy when it comes to the Black community. Now, a negative aspect of it rears its head in that out of the lynchings that occurred in Maryland, and yes, Maryland had race terror and lynchings, but the documented lynchings, there was about 40 of them. 5 took place in Prince George's County. And those are documented. There are other cases of just acts of terror, shootings, beatings. Brentwood itself was a sundown town. So you could live in North Brentwood, but if you go into Brentwood, your tail had to be out of town by sundown. You could come and work there, but you better leave unless you have reason to be there. And growing up in DC in the 60s and the 70s, I'm dating myself. A lot of my friends, we were afraid, and I told Tony this, to come into Prince George's County at a certain point. Before more Black people started moving out, there were certain portions of Prince George's County I didn't want to come to because of issues with people who were policing Black communities, but were not from the Black community. Yeah. And so you had certain issues, but I'll leave it.
And just to piggyback, because again, and I tell my students this, sometimes, cotton was king, and we think, all enslaved African Americans were picking cotton. You have to, depending on where you were geographically, Maryland and Virginia, parts of North Carolina, Kentucky, it was, tobacco ruled. And I know for my family, my mother's parents both come from rural Prince Edward County, Virginia. They both had tobacco farms. I have a picture of my great grandfather, with knee-high, thigh-high tobacco plants. That's what they worked in. So, and Prince George's County, you see remnants of this. Again, I say I take tours, and Roger hit me up to this. There are actually, if you go to a community off of Lake Arbor, now I live near Lake Arbor. This community has been here since I've been here, and you find out new things every day. He hit me up to a fact that there were the remnants of 2 enslaved cabins right in the middle of a community. It's right on Waterfowl Court, I believe. Anyone can go see it. You can see the foundations of 2 enslaved cabins. It's called the Northampton Slave Quarters. And I've taken students there, and they're, the descendants of the people that were enslaved there still come back to that area. They still, celebrate their family life that descended from that particular area. I can tell you another spot. My sister moved into another development between Glenarden and Seabrook. I mean, you can use both postal addresses. I mean, it's kind of in a nebulous space, but it's where, I can't remember them all, but it's where Costco and Wegmans and, Silver Diner in that area. My sister and my mother and I were just taking a walk. That's what we like to do, just taking a walk in the neighborhood. And lo and behold, come up on 2 plaques talking about the history of what became known as Rosemount Plantation. Right. And it talked about the families that owned that particular land. And then it talked about the enslaved people that worked that land. And, the dichotomy was very different, of course, but did not know that was there, just happened to walk up on it. So again, sometimes, and I told Roger this and other people, sometimes the best things that I find are things that I wasn't even looking for, but it's there. if you choose to look for it. But of course, I believe one of my responsibilities is to bring light to that.
Right.
And again, I start with my students and then branch out from there. So, and as to the fact that, Maryland threatened a couple of times to join the Confederacy. There was a very real possibility. Now, of course, Lincoln had to really hold on to Maryland because Virginia had already gone. Of course, we know DC is surrounded by these two states. So he definitely had to hold on to Maryland. And that's not to say that many Marylanders did not fight for the Confederacy, because they did. Even though the state remained in the Union, there was a lot of people that, crossed that line and fought for the Confederacy. So we need to understand that as well. And you talked about contemporary issues, and Roger also made a point of this as well. There was a time when Prince George's County was notorious for the police force and their brutality. And not only, and I heard of that growing up, but I could also give you some anecdotes of that reputation even going outside. I told you I was in the Midwest. I was in Indiana, worked at Purdue University, and this was right around the time of Freddie Gray's death. In I believe April of 2015 in Baltimore, where he was died in police custody. And of course, students there had already had racial incidents in the residence halls and classrooms and things of that nature. So this national story just added to the anxiety that some of the students were feeling. So we've had meetings and things of that nature. And I remember there was a professor of sociology, a brother, I can't remember his name, apologies for that, but we were in a discussion one time and I mentioned that I was from Prince George's County, and the first word out of his mouth was, whoa. He's like, you're from Prince George's County? I said, yes. Because he studied how, police community relations, and Prince George's was one of the areas that he studied. So, that hit me up like, okay, PG's got a reputation beyond this area. It was reinforced. We had a meeting with the police chief of Indianapolis, because Indianapolis is not that far. So he came, and he's another brother. And I, again, in conversation with him, mentioned that I was from Prince George's County. And he said, whoa, because he used to work in Baltimore. And I'm not sure how accurate this is, but he said there was at one time when the Prince George's County Police Department was under more federal investigation
Yes.
for their conduct than any other police force in the United States.
Yes.
And I was like, wow. So that infamous reputation is not just known to people that grew up in this area. That has gone beyond, even state borders. So that just let me know that, this is where Prince George's County is getting recognition for the wrong reasons.
The wrong reasons.
Definitely wrong reasons. So they, again, with all the tragedies that we're dealing with, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and many, many others, I can go on and on. That resonates as well. I remember the case of, I believe, Prince Jones back in the early 2000s. I believe that was his name. Yeah, about, being killed by an undercover police officer, a Black undercover police officer in this instance. And the anxiety and the anger around that particular issue. So, there's been a struggle in this county for quite a bit. There's the positive attributes, but of course, there are also the negative attributes of the county as well.
And and unfortunately, it overshadowed the rich history of this county, and how African Americans in this county, how Africans in this county added to the history of Maryland. The first Black, and I'll come back to this later, but one of the first Black fire departments, Chapel Oaks, was founded, a Black volunteer fire department, and in the communities that were created. See, Tony and I both tell our students, when Blacks were denied access to education, access to public spaces, they built their own. Mm-hmm. And this is exemplified in what happened in this county. Black people built their own. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, unfortunately, those outside who come inside the county tend to ignore that history. Maybe we need to do a better job of putting it out there. But that history is rich. And coming from DC, I felt it. Because when DC was gentrified, it is just like the people who were there, who created that situation that you wanted to come to, the hip, the cool, the funky. Now you want us out.
The people that put the blood equity into those areas when nobody wanted to come to say
Right.
U Street or
Right.
Florida Avenue, you know, the people that stayed there and struggled there in the aftermath, particularly of the, however you want to frame it, whether you want to look at it as riots or rebellions in the aftermath of Dr. King's assassination, April 4th, 1968, you know, before, and again, you know, on DC, but before the subway systems were built, nobody wanted to come there. You know, nobody wanted to. Most of the Black businesses started to leave and are now gone. You know, there are only 3, you know, long established businesses that remain there. And just to add on what Roger said, I mean, I just found out about Lakeland, which is in, you know, off of US 1, right near University of Maryland College Park, was one of those kinds of communities where, again, African Americans were limited in the space that they can go. And so they created their own vibrant spaces, you know, with their churches and their schools and their community organizations and their fraternal and benevolent organizations. And we've done that countless times throughout the United States. And again, that's one of the things I show my students. I take trips to Richmond. I take trips to Cambridge, Maryland, and Baltimore, Maryland, and Wilmington, Delaware, and you know, and other places, and show that, you know, the how African Americans were just so resilient in making lemonade out of lemons, to put it in its simplest terms. But you know, there's some viable communities. Those are communities that have history, that have lived history, that people, you know, remember, that people hold on to, that people are trying to, you know, establish. I know Lakeland does have a small book. They do have a historical society there, which they come out with a small book under, I believe, the Blacks in America series, which I have and am reading right now, because there's another project that I'm involved in, African Americans in the C&O Canal Project, and Lakeland is one of those communities that we're studying along with others, you know, in Montgomery County and elsewhere. And you just see the vibrancy and the resilience of African Americans, people of African descent, in dealing with the challenges that we're faced with. And it's a beautiful thing to see. I mean, it's a beautiful thing to see.
I definitely want to come back to that point. I know we have a question from one of our panelists. One of our attendees. I'm gonna get to that question in a moment. I wanted you all to both first speak on Prince George's County and this moniker that it's had about being the most affluent county for African Americans in the country, right? That has been this you know, it's something that you hear quite frequently. But if you look at the data, it shows that in the state of Maryland, we're actually number 17 in terms of wealth, right? And if you look at our neighboring counties, and it's not about comparison, but it's also being mindful of the fact that some of that same amount of wealth, you would think that there would be some access to it in terms of the proximity of of those of your neighboring communities. So it doesn't necessarily sit there. Can you all speak to that? But then also, when you talk about the rich history, this is a part 2 to the question. Can you liken Prince George's County to any of the other places like Tulsa? And I use Tulsa because we just talked about its 100th, the 100th a commemoration of 100 years since the race massacre. Can you speak to those two points, please?
Roger.
Well, I'll bring it forward if you could jump in.
Okay.
After emancipation, you have this situation where you have African Americans in the rural portions of Prince George's County attempting to get land, forming communities. You have North Brentwood, you have places like Fairmont Heights, and there's, you know, and you have also a Black middle class that's forming from workers in DC, people who get jobs, nice jobs, government jobs. Prince George's County then is becoming, for many Blacks, a bedroom community. They're building their churches, they're building homes, they're building communities. Even Eagle Harbor, which was a recreational community for African Americans. However, the problem is that as time went on, you still have you have inexpensive, and I'm not saying cheap, but affordable housing out here. Communities being built, and of course, I'm part of the last of these migrants coming out here from DC. But the problem with Prince George's County, even though you have people with a lot of money, I have a brother-in-law that lives in a gated community out here. And it's funny because the gated community street he lives on is named after the Spriggs family that had slaves. And in the War of 1812, their slaves ran off and they got paid by the federal government for it. But let me get back to this. You have people with money. It shows up in the cars, it shows up in the property, it shows up in the housing. But what we don't have in this county is wealth from businesses. You have small business, but we're bedroom community to others. See, the reason why Montgomery County has wealth is because they can get tax revenue from these larger businesses moving there. The same with Annapolis and others. And my question is, why not Prince George's? There's land, it's affordable. The people here would love jobs instead of having to commute. Is there something wrong with us out here? The black and the brown, is it that you're afraid we can't? Or is there a stigma that's attached to our schools? Because I'm going to tell you right now, I have neighbors whose children are on 4-year scholarships. In fact, one neighbor, both of his daughters are in medical school, and one has a full ride to a large Research One university. All 4-year scholarships, and they went to local schools. So my question is, yes, we're supposedly wealthy for blacks, but that wealth is not true wealth. That wealth comes from income, nice paying jobs in Washington and the government and other places and support industries, and maybe some land and houses that you own. But the county itself suffers because for some reason, businesses don't move out here. I thought we were going to get the FBI, but Trump messed that up. Anyway, Tony.
Again, as a lifelong resident of PG County, it sometimes depends on, and there always seemed to be a divide. I remember watching, people that did traffic on the news, and they talked about the inner beltway and the outer beltway, where it's kind of analogous to where people live and how, people are seen and people are treated. I don't think, or at least in my estimation, people see Capitol Heights, what they call the Heights, Capitol Heights, District Heights, Fairmont Heights, Landover, Palmer Park, Glen Arden, Lanham, Seabrook, Riverdale, the same way they see where I live, Largo, Upper Marlboro, Bowie, Mitchellville, Woodmore, where some of these gated communities exist. I don't know if, let's be clear about this. Even in segregated neighborhoods where you had all African Americans live despite class, there are class divisions between black folks.
Yes.
Even in those segregated communities, I'll use Baltimore as an example, you had upper and middle class black folks that lived on certain streets, even though they're all confined to the same neighborhood. And in this instance, what they used to call Old Northwest Baltimore, which is now, spliced by Pennsylvania Avenue, you had upper and middle class black folks live on places like Druid Hill Avenue, McCullough Street, things of that nature. If you go to Richmond, Jackson Ward, there were certain streets, designated Quality Row, because that's where middle and upper class African Americans lived. And then lower and working class black folks would live on streets adjacent or branching off from that, sometimes in alleys. I mean, you literally had alley dwellings. So even within, even in segregation, you had class divisions amongst black folks. Now, you had an uplift ideology amongst some of the elite, meaning that, I'm in a better position, but I'm not really totally free unless I help to lift up, my lower brothers and sisters. You did have that kind of ideology, but still, you had very prominent class divisions amongst African Americans. And those socioeconomic divisions still exist, even in a county supposedly as affluent as Prince George's County. And we have to be very real and very clear about that. In terms of businesses, I'll talk about Largo Town Center, which is not that far up the street from me. That used to have Magic Johnson Theater, which is now AMC. Okay, that used to have stores and a mall, and I remember before leaving the excitement that people had when that came. That's no longer there. Those businesses are gone. I mean, we had a Gold's Gym, we had, I believe, a Barnes and Noble, we had clothing stores and things of that nature. That space now is occupied by a hospital, which just recently opened. There are a few restaurants there. There's still Chuck E. Cheese. There's still, that Chick-fil-A is stays crowded. Chick-fil-A stays crowded. But it's nowhere near where it used to be. You know, there's still Caroline's Kitchen. There's still eateries. Let's say that there's still eateries there. But in terms of the, you know, the clothing stores and the other small businesses, those are no longer there and have not been there for a while. So again, we need that investment. And unfortunately, and Roger, you know, you said this before, you know, before we went on, even some African Americans have this idea that Black businesses don't have the level of customer service that they should. Now, that's not to say that, you know, you should have a certain level of customer service, but it's almost ingrained, even in Black folks, that we don't treat each other very well. We don't, you know, we don't have the type of, you know, we don't give the type of services that you may find in other businesses. That stigma still exists. I will say some of my family members have that kind of thing, unfortunately. But yeah, so even in businesses that were here, you start to see those go away and those start to disappear. I'm actually still surprised that Bowie Town Center exists.
Bowie Town Center's having a lot of problems. Everything's moving down to Crofton. It's white flight still. Mm-hmm. And, you know, when we talk about Crofton and other places, you talk about, you know, and not to sound classist or anybody's feeling, but we're talking about working class whites as well, compared to white collar Blacks who are out here. So, you know, I mean, when we talk about the issue with class and what's going on in Prince George's County, I believe that, you know, we need to support Black businesses or small businesses, but we need to also attract large business. We need to attract IT. We need to attract those headquarters and things that are supporting the government and the federal government. And I totally agree with Tony on a lot of that. You know, going back to what you said about perceptions of African American workers, one of the issues that occurs here, and Tiffany, you mentioned comparing us to Tulsa. Someone mentioned one time, was it Everton, Florida, or some places like that. I never did like the term for Tulsa, Black Wall Street. That was coined by somebody who lived there. Tulsa just had a thriving business district. Every city where there was large, substantial Black communities had a thriving business district. Every city had a Black Wall Street. DC, Philadelphia, Richmond. It wasn't just Tulsa. And so when you come to here, this area at that time was semi-rural, but there were other places that were semi-rural. And so to compare this to them, yeah, we had our own Black businesses, our own Black schools, our own Black churches. One of the things that has hurt Black communities was integration. Integration was envisioned as a thing that would move African Americans forward. The problem is when it came to living spaces and recreational spaces, people didn't want to integrate. You can't legislate that. So as Blacks were allowed to move in, others moved out. When restrictive covenants restricting the sale of houses and communities to white people, when those were broken down and Blacks moved in, other people moved out and moved farther away. Too many times when allowed to go, and I tell you, I was one of those. Both of my parents graduated from HBCUs, right? So when it came my time to go to college, they wanted me to go to Howard. I was like, I need to get out of DC. I'm not going to Howard. I need to get away from home. They mentioned other HBCUs, but in my mind, in the 70s, wow, well, we have arrived. I don't need to go to an HBCU. Let me go to a predominantly white institution. See, a lot of times we've abandoned our newspapers, our insurance companies, our banks. And so integration should have gone both ways. Not just Black people going to where they couldn't go, but white people coming to enjoy those businesses that Blacks own, those spaces that Blacks own. And instead of doing that, folk moved away. The tax bases began to fall because the middle-class Blacks moved away chasing middle-class and upper-class whites. And that's a terrible thing to have to say. And even with our school systems, they tried to integrate the school systems. And at some point, instead of allowing the school system to integrate, people moved away. Therefore, if you had a school that was mostly white, a few Blacks would get in there, whites would move out, the school became mostly Black. That doesn't mean that it was a bad school, not at all. And see, that's where the thinking needs to change. So if you don't want to enjoy me, if you don't care for me, well, you lose out. See, in Prince George's County, that's majority Black. You're losing out on the opportunity of workers, spaces for jobs, spaces for recreation. And as Tony said, don't focus on the underserved in a negative way. Focus on the underserved in a way that maybe they could use some jobs. Also see that there is a thriving entrepreneurial class, a managerial class, a class of academics here that could better serve Maryland as a whole.
And just to add real quick, because Roger said there were several Black Wall Streets. We forget there was a Black Wall Street in Durham, North Carolina. There was a Black Wall Street in Syracuse, New York. I found this out. So there was, several areas. And again, Jackson Ward in Richmond, Virginia was seen as the center of, they say they inscribed on some of their plaques, the center of Black capitalism. And as Roger pointed out, one of the reasons why the Greenwood district in Tulsa was set up on was not only were African-Americans prosperous there, but some whites actually started to patronize the businesses there as well, which of course white supremacists could not, so you're going to take money out of our community and send it to the Negroes? Oh no, amongst a myriad of other reasons why they attacked Tulsa as they did. But that's also, because African-Americans were getting outside of the box that people thought that we should be in.
It happened in Chicago. It happened in DC.
There are so many
every time
examples.
there was a race massacre, they attacked the economic center of the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
That was their main target, because in many instances, it wasn't because African-Americans were choosing to stay in their places, it was because African-Americans were not staying in their place. Mm-hmm. That those attacks and things of that nature came. So I just wanted to add that. But I agree with Roger, on that level as well.
This is just a really powerful discussion. I want to go back and make a point about Tulsa in a moment, but I want to speak to Cheryl Garnett's question and wanted to give you all an opportunity to respond. With you all being Black scholars at an HBCU, I think that this was something we were going to pose, but she wanted for you all to talk about the racial injustices at the University of Maryland College Park back in the early 50s, when President Byrd supported funding to Maryland's HBCUs to try to keep Blacks out of the College Park campus. And also if you can share any history on Bowie State in particular. I would love for you all to elaborate on those points, please.
Sure. Again, the University of Maryland College Park, has a very contentious history with that, because at one point, some people think that Jim Crow just fell from the sky, and just segregated Black folks and white folks. In some instances, it was very gradual. In some places, it didn't come until the early 20th century, not immediately after Reconstruction ended in 1877. So at one time, particularly the University of Maryland College Park was accepting African Americans in very small numbers, but they were accepting African Americans, particularly to their law school, because there were several, graduates of the law school, until of course in the early 20th century when they shut that down for several decades, until of course it was opened up by Donald Murray through a lawsuit, aided by a rising star named Thurgood Marshall and his mentor, Charles Hamilton Houston. And I should say that the road to Brown was built in Maryland. I will say that. The road to Brown was laid in Maryland, particularly Baltimore, in the teachers' salary equalization cases from 1936 to 1941. Again, that's forgotten. That's one of my missions, is to place Maryland, back where it belongs, in the forefront of this, this struggle for equitable society. So, after that, which it didn't even have to reach the Supreme Court, the Maryland Court of Appeals allowed Donald Murray to integrate. And from there, you had gradual numbers of African Americans entering, particularly the professional and graduate schools. There was definitely resistance to the undergrad level, they'll let us into the graduate and professional schools. And again, people may not know that University of Maryland Law School is actually in Baltimore. It's not in College Park. So they would do that, but the struggle and the fight to allow African Americans on the undergraduate level was a long, protracted one. And of course, it was resisted at every turn by all of the presidents of the university until, of course, they later relented. In terms, so, and we still see that unequal relationship today. Bowie State particularly, and the other three HBCUs, Coppin State, University of Maryland, Eastern Shore, are part of the University of Maryland system. Now, Morgan chose to be independent, but you still see that all four HBCUs had to sue the state in terms of unequitable resources and financing for, you know, the HBCUs as opposed to some of the PWIs in this state. And even though, of course, we won our case, thankfully, again, after a long protracted struggle, and I'm still learning the ins and outs of what that entails. But now it comes to, okay, now that we've got, you know, a favorable decision, now it comes to the state actually taking action and making that decision real in terms of resources, curriculum, things of that nature. I will say, as a graduate of Bowie, and I've actually met some of the people, Bowie, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Bowie has had a long struggle to, you know, make, you know, an effort to be equitable there. There was student protests in specifically 1968, where students were complaining about the lack of facilities, you know, not having the curriculum, say, that some of the PWIs had in terms of some of the courses, you know, that were offered and things of that nature. Some, you know, everybody understands the terrible food that sometimes, you know, and the lack of cafeteria services and things of that nature. So students actually protested in 1968 at Bowie State. Now, this was the time when Spiro Agnew was governor of Maryland. And one of the ways that Spiro Agnew ingratiated himself, you know, in the Republican administration of Richard Nixon was to be tough with the students at Bowie, where he actually sent law enforcement to literally shut down the campus and run the students off of campus. I've had oral in talking to some of the students where, you know, law enforcement literally came on campus and said, basically, you got 5 or 10 minutes to get all your stuff and leave, or there are going to be consequences and repercussions. And so students that were left on campus, you know, had to pack up their belongings and they had to leave the campus because the campus was shut down. And of course, this was during the Black Power era. This is when there was a fully entrenched white backlash against some of the gains that African Americans were achieving. And of course, a backlash against some of the things that African Americans are still saying are unresolved, like, you know, the facilities and things at Bowie State. And so, you know, Agnew thought that, and then this is this idea of Maryland as this liberal state, as this supposedly progressive state, where it's like, we're making progress. Yes, we had slavery and things of that nature, but we're making progress. And you know, we have this era of good relations. We've already had good relations between the races. We've already had this, you know, this era of goodwill. So just let us handle, you know, let us just handle things the way we as a state should handle them without this government intervention and things of that nature, which of course, this liberalism eschewed swift action in taking care of these things and not fully addressing the racial inequality that is going on. And so the fact that Bowie and Morgan and Coppin and UMES, you know, still has to sue the state of Maryland for unequal distribution of resources and unbalanced curriculum. And in fact, if I recall correctly, and someone may correct me, you know, they were replicating programs that these HBCUs had at these PWIs, but they were financing those and leaving us to blow in the wind, basically. It's just almost a continuous cycle where you become frustrated. We're still, in some instances, fighting the same battles. You know, we're still having to deal with some of the same issues. I remember, you know, as an undergrad, my freshman year, you know, they were going to hike up the tuition, which was not a lot. But when you're talking about a lot of working class, you know, students, you know, that 3%, you know, what they try to propose, I believe, a 10% increase. We wanted a 3%. We knew it was going to increase, but not by that much. You've had these struggles to where we had to occupy the campus and spend the night and, have protests and things of that nature. So it's been a long, it's been a long, contentious struggle. But as great Frederick Douglass said, where there's no struggle, there's no progress. So struggle continues.
Dr. Davidson?
Well, I think Tony said it all as far as that goes. And it is a shame that we had to sue the state for some equity. But what was it, $500 million, was it, Tony, in the settlement?
I believe so, somewhere
over
in that
a 10-year period or something like that. I can't remember what the exact, that's still not enough when you're thinking of dividing it between 4 universities, especially when you see what the other universities, I'm not talking about just University of Maryland. I'm talking about sister universities like Towson and Frostburg,
University of Baltimore and
University of Baltimore. I mean, here you have University of Baltimore. I was a cop in 16 years. University of Baltimore, they built a whole new stage and thing for the performing arts there. But the real performing arts program was at Coppin State. It was totally ignored. And the state doesn't do enough to promote these institutions. Bowie State University and Morgan State University have produced stellar military officers through their ROTC programs. You don't hear about it. Bowie State University, as far as let's say colleges or universities that serve the community, does a great job at an awesome price. The state needs to help to promote this. You don't have to go to the University of Maryland. You can come to Bowie and get an outstanding education. What's better yet, instead of being in a class of 300, you're in a class of 30. Your professor can talk to you. You come to our office. You see us at the mall. We can go to Rita's and get ice cream. It's and work with you. But again, this is just part of it.
There, just for time's sake, I know I'm not going to have the time to ask other questions. I will like to say that I echo some of your sentiments because I have had a long career, and one of the top 3 decisions that I've ever made in my professional career was to hire and onboard Maya Washington, who is a recent Bowie State graduate. She is amazing. So although she's not a military leader, she's absolutely a rising star over here at nonprofit Prince George's County. So so I wanted to just echo the type of talent that Bowie State produces. So I appreciate that. And she was also one of your students, Dr. Davidson. So she has been a huge cheerleader for you. What I would like to say kind of in closing, and again, when I say that this is the beginning of a conversation, I am going to be coming back and circling back with you all to figure out how can we look for some ways and resources to create a series of conversations like this that are ongoing, because we cannot capture all of the thought leadership and information that you all have that is needed in our community. And then for the nonprofit sector, we are working in so many different spaces addressing health and human services issues across the entire county. What, in closing, what's some of the thought leadership that you would leave people with, if we can wrap it up, in terms of what you think that people should, what nonprofits should be considering and thinking about as we continue to engage in this work? And I know it's very broad-based, but something that I wanted for you all to think about.
I really think a lot of nonprofits should look to come here to try to expand the business base here within Prince George's County. Whatever your nonprofit does, come to PG, and I am going to call it PG, and I call it that out of love. Come here to PG, and you find residents that will do well for whatever business you're in, or if you're looking to provide service to a community, there are communities that your nonprofit can serve. But please come to PG. And when it comes to Bowie State, we are developing an entrepreneurship institute that focuses also on nonprofits. So contact the School of Business, and you may find that there's some niche there, whether you need help or want to provide help for PG, that we can work together as partners.
Thank you.
I echo that as well.
Well, I also want to say thank you because I have on here Cheryl Garnett. She has been super active in the chat. And so she's actually our vice president of our board. And so she's also the president of Ivy Community Charities. And so she also echoes the fact that a series of conversations would be welcomed in our nonprofit community. So I just want you all to know that we are going to have a follow-up conversation because I would like your input on how we would be able to create that with you all, you know, taking the lead and even identifying some other scholars that should be present at the table for this type of series of conversations. So thank you so much. I was so honored to learn more and to be in your presence. I have many more questions and they will be answered because this is just the beginning. This is not the end. I call them comma conversations, so not period conversations. Is there a way that people can follow you on social media? Would you like to share that information?
Well, you can find me on Twitter and under Roger Davidson and on LinkedIn. I don't do Facebook.
I am on Facebook, Tony Gass. I will be getting an Instagram page. I finally conceded, and a Twitter page. I was kind of resistant to it, but you know, I'm coming around. So I will once I get those established, I will make those available.
Thank you both, Dr. Davidson and Dr. Gass, for the work that you're doing, for your wisdom that you shared, and just for being so passionate and bold. That is a commitment that I have in this work. I want us to always be able to be bold and to speak out because our ancestors didn't have that opportunity in the way that we do. And so I want to be able to continue on that legacy of those people who did have some form of agency or were able to enact upon that sense of agency. I want us to be able to continue to do the same thing. So thank you for participating in this conversation. Truly value it. And we will be talking again soon. So I hope that everybody enjoys the rest of their day.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being allowed to speak for this audience, and I look forward to continued conversations.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one, folks.